July 4th, 1827. While America celebrated its independence, a slave woman named Phyllis in the sweltering plantations of New Orleans was planning her own declaration of freedom. What she did to 3 brutal overseers that Independence Day would become the most whispered story throughout the South. A tale of revenge so shocking that plantation owners would never speak of it openly, yet never forget its terrifying details. This is the true story of how one woman's breaking point led to the most brutal act of retribution ever recorded on American soil. The Louisiana sun beat down mercilessly on Magnolia Grove Plantation, 20 miles southwest of New Orleans, where the humid air hung like a suffocating blanket over the endless rows of sugarcane. The year 1827 had been particularly cruel, with Master Harrison Whitmore demanding increased production to meet the growing demands of northern refineries. The crack of whips echoed across the fields like thunder, punctuating the rhythmic songs of enslaved workers who labored from dawn until dusk. Phyllis Washington, a 28-year-old woman with calloused hands and determined eyes, moved through the cane stalks with practiced efficiency. Born on the plantation, she had known no other life than this cycle of backbreaking labor and constant fear. Her dark skin glistened with sweat as she wielded her cane knife, each stroke precise despite the exhaustion that weighed down her shoulders like iron chains. The plantation sprawled across 800 acres of rich Mississippi River Delta soil, its grand mansion standing in stark contrast to the ramshackle slave quarters that housed over 200 enslaved souls. Whitmore had inherited the property from his father, along with its reputation for brutality that made even neighboring plantation owners uncomfortable. The master rarely involved himself in daily operations, preferring to leave such matters to his 3 overseers, James Iron Fist McKenna, Thomas Bull Patterson, and Samuel Snake Rodriguez. These 3 men ruled the plantation with unprecedented cruelty. McKenna, a red-faced Irishman with scarred knuckles, took pleasure in devising creative punishments for the slightest infractions. Patterson, whose massive frame cast shadows that made grown men tremble, specialized in public beatings that served as warnings to others. Rodriguez, the most cunning of the 3, had a talent for psychological torment that left wounds deeper than any whip. Before continuing with Phyllis's story, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from America's hidden history, because what happened next would change everything on that Independence Day. Phyllis had endured their cruelty for years, watching friends disappear into the night after failed escape attempts, seeing children separated from mothers for arbitrary reasons, witnessing strong men broken by relentless abuse. But it was the events of the past, a month that had pushed her beyond the breaking point. Her younger brother Moses, just 16 years old, had been caught sharing his meager food ration with an elderly woman too weak to work. McKenna's punishment had been swift and severe. 50 lashes followed by 3 days in the punishment box, a wooden cage barely large enough for a child, left in the scorching sun without water. Moses had emerged broken in spirit, his back a map of infected wounds that refused to heal in the humid climate. The breaking point came on July 2nd, when Rodriguez decided that Phyllis herself needed correction for looking at him directly when he gave orders. In his twisted mind, this constituted insubordination that required immediate punishment. What followed was an assault so brutal and degrading that even other slaves looked away in horror. Phyllis endured it in silence, her jaw clenched, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the pain. But inside her mind, something fundamental had shifted. The careful balance of survival she had maintained for years crumbled, replaced by a cold, calculating fury that surprised her with its intensity. As she lay on the dirt floor of her quarters that night, listening to the sounds of the plantation settling into uneasy sleep, she began to plan. The irony was not lost on her that Independence Day was approaching. She had listened to enough conversations between house slaves and their masters to understand the significance of July 4th, a day when white Americans celebrated their freedom from tyranny. The bitter humor of her situation fueled her determination. If America could declare independence from its oppressors, perhaps it was time for her to declare her own. The plan began to form in her mind like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. She knew the routines of all three overseers, their weaknesses, their habits. McKenna's love of whiskey, Patterson's predictable patrol routes, Rodriguez's tendency to abuse his authority in isolated areas of the plantation. She understood the layout of every building, every hiding place, every tool that could serve her purpose. As July 3rd dawned with the promise of another scorching day, Phyllis moved through her morning routine with the outward appearance of resigned compliance, while her mind raced with final preparations. The other slaves noticed nothing unusual. She had learned long ago to mask her thoughts behind an expression of weary acceptance. But beneath the surface, she was a woman transformed, driven by a purpose that made her feel more alive than she had in years. The plantation buzzed with unusual activity as Master Whitmore prepared for his annual Independence Day celebration. Every year, he invited neighboring plantation owners and their families for an elaborate feast, complete with fireworks and speeches about American liberty. The enslaved population would be expected to work extra hours preparing for the festivities, while being reminded that such celebrations were not meant for their kind. Phyllis had volunteered for kitchen duty, a request that surprised Mammy Ruth, the head cook who had known her since birth. "Child, you ain't never wanted to work in that hot kitchen before," the elderly woman observed, her weathered hands kneading dough for the next day's feast. "What's got into you?" "Just thought I could use a change from the fields," Phyllis replied, her voice steady. In truth, kitchen duty would give her access to certain tools and allow her to observe the movements of household staff and overseers throughout the day. More importantly, it would place her near the plantation's main buildings when darkness fell. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Phyllis peeled vegetables, stirred enormous pots of jambalaya, and helped prepare the elaborate desserts that would grace Master Whitmore's table. All the while, she catalogued every detail of her surroundings, the location of carving knives, the schedule of servants, moving between buildings, the habits of the three overseers as they supervised preparations. McKenna spent most of the day in the barn, ostensibly checking supplies, but actually drinking from a bottle he kept hidden behind feed sacks. His face grew redder as the hours passed, and his movements became increasingly unsteady. Patterson made his rounds with military precision, his massive frame intimidating even the boldest field hands into submission. Rodriguez lingered near the house, using his proximity to the master's family as an excuse to assert his authority over the domestic staff. As evening approached, Phyllis excused herself from kitchen duties, claiming she needed to check on her sick brother in the quarters. Mammy Ruth nodded absently, too busy with final preparations to question the request. The old woman had noticed something different about Phyllis that day, a quiet intensity that reminded her of a snake coiled to strike, but attributed it to the stress of extra work. The slave quarters consisted of a dozen long, low buildings arranged in parallel rows, each housing 20 families in cramped, airless rooms. Phyllis made her way to the building where she and Moses shared a space no larger than a horse stall with 2 other families. Her brother lay on a pile of rags that served as bedding, his fever-bright eyes tracking her movement as she knelt beside him. "Sister," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the general noise of families preparing for another night of fitful sleep. "You look different tonight. What's happening?" Phyllis touched his burning forehead gently. The wounds on his back had become infected despite her careful attention, and she knew that without proper medicine, which would never be provided for a slave, his condition would only worsen. The thought strengthened her resolve. "Tomorrow is Independence Day," she said quietly, her words carrying a weight that made Moses's eyes widen despite his fever. "Maybe it's time we understood what that really means." She spent the next hour moving carefully through the quarters, speaking in whispers to certain individuals she had identified as potential allies. Not everyone was ready to hear her message, but a few, those who had suffered the worst under the current regime, listened with growing understanding. She wasn't asking them to join her immediate plan, but she wanted them to be prepared for what might come after. Old Samuel, a man whose wife had died under McKenna's whip the previous winter, gripped her hand with surprising strength. "Whatever you're planning, child, you be careful. These devils ain't gonna just disappear quietly." "I know," Phyllis replied, "but sometimes being careful ain't enough. Sometimes you got to take risks to make things change." As the night deepened and the plantation settled into an uneasy quiet, Phyllis made her final preparations. She had fashioned 3 lengths of strong rope from materials gathered throughout the day: hemp from the barn, twine from kitchen supplies, strips of leather from old harnesses. Each rope was approximately 8 feet long and tied with special knots she had learned from an old sailor who had worked briefly on the plantation years earlier. The tools she would need were already in place: a sharp knife from the kitchen, hidden earlier behind the smokehouse, and a small hatchet from the tool shed that she could access through a loose board she had discovered months ago. Everything was ready. All that remained was to wait for the right moment. The morning of July 4th, 1827, dawned with oppressive humidity that seemed to press down on the plantation like a physical weight. Phyllis woke before the bell, her body alert despite having slept only briefly. Around her, other slaves began stirring in the cramped quarters, preparing for what they expected to be another day of increased labor in service of their master's celebration. The plantation grounds were already bustling with activity by sunrise. House slaves hurried between buildings, carrying linens, china, and decorations for the evening's festivities. Field slaves were assigned to special duties, some to harvest the finest vegetables from the garden, others to prepare the grounds for the arrival of guests. The 3 overseers moved among them with unusual energy, their authority magnified by the importance of the day. Phyllis reported to the kitchen as expected, but Mammy Ruth immediately noticed the change in her demeanor. The young woman's usual quiet compliance had been replaced by something harder to define, a watchful stillness that reminded the old cook of predators she had seen in the Louisiana swamps. "You feeling all right, child?" Mammy Ruth asked as they began preparing the elaborate meal that would feed 50 of the region's wealthiest plantation owners. "You got a look about you that's making me nervous." "I'm fine," Phyllis replied, her hands steady as she chopped vegetables with mechanical precision, just thinking about what this day means. Throughout the morning, she tracked the movements of McKenna, Patterson, and Rodriguez with the patience of a hunter. McKenna had started drinking earlier than usual, celebrating the holiday with increased enthusiasm for his hidden bottle. Patterson maintained his rigid schedule, but seemed more aggressive in his interactions with the enslaved workers, as if the presence of visiting masters required him to demonstrate his authority more forcefully. Rodriguez spent most of his time near the house, preening for the benefit of any guests who arrived early. The first carriages began arriving around noon, bringing families dressed in their finest clothes to celebrate American independence. Phyllis watched from the kitchen window as men in expensive suits and women in elaborate dresses stepped down from their vehicles, laughing and talking about liberty and freedom while surrounded by the evidence of human bondage. The irony was not lost on the enslaved population, who exchanged meaningful glances as they served drinks and arranged seating for their oppressors' celebration. But Phyllis was beyond irony now. She had moved into a state of cold determination that left no room for bitter humor. As the afternoon wore on, the guests settled into the familiar rhythm of such gatherings. The men congregated on the wide veranda of the main house, discussing politics and business, while sampling Master Whitmore's finest whiskey. The women gathered in the shade of ancient oak trees, their parasols creating patterns of light and shadow as they gossiped about neighbors and planned future social events. Children ran across the manicured lawn, their laughter a stark contrast to the silent tension that always existed between the enslaved workers and their masters. No slave children were visible. They had been confined to the quarters for the duration of the celebration, their presence considered inappropriate for such a refined gathering. By 4 o'clock, the heat had become nearly unbearable. Even the wealthy guests began wilting in the oppressive humidity, their fancy clothes becoming uncomfortable burdens. Several retreated to the cooler interior of the house, while others sought shade wherever they could find it. This was exactly what Phyllis had been waiting for. The scattered locations of guests would make it easier to move undetected, and the general lethargy brought on by heat and alcohol would work to her advantage. She excused herself from kitchen duties once again, this time claiming she needed to tend to some chickens that had escaped their pen. The first target was McKenna, whose drinking had progressed to the point where he could barely walk straight. She found him exactly where she expected, behind the barn, slumped against a water trough with his bottle nearly empty. The other slaves had learned to avoid this area when McKenna was drinking, knowing that his violent tendencies increased with his consumption of alcohol. Well, he slurred as Phyllis approached, his red-rimmed eyes focusing on her with difficulty. If it ain't our uppity field hand, you come to apologize for yesterday's attitude? Phyllis moved closer, her expression neutral. In her hand, hidden behind her back, was the knife she had retrieved from its hiding place. I came to give you something special for Independence Day, she said quietly. McKenna's laugh was harsh and ugly. Independence Day? Ain't for the likes of you, girl. You need to remember your place. He struggled to his feet, swaying dangerously. Maybe I need to remind you again. Maybe you do, Phyllis replied, and struck with the speed of a snake. The knife went deep between McKenna's ribs, angled upward toward his heart. His eyes widened in shock and disbelief as he looked down at the handle protruding from his chest. He tried to speak, but only blood emerged from his mouth. Phyllis watched without emotion as he collapsed, his body convulsing briefly before going still. Working quickly, she retrieved the first length of rope from where she had hidden it nearby. McKenna's belt came off easily, and she used the knife to make the necessary cuts with surgical precision. The rope went around his neck, then down to encircle what remained of his manhood, creating a grotesque display that would send an unmistakable message to anyone who found him. But she wasn't finished. This was only the beginning. The chill afternoon sun cast long shadows across the plantation grounds as Phyllis moved with purposeful stealth toward her second target. The sounds of celebration continued from the main house. Laughter, music, and the clink of glasses raised in toasts to American liberty. None of the revelers suspected that their holiday was being marked by a very different kind of independence declaration in the working areas of the plantation. Thomas "Bull" Patterson was exactly where she expected to find him, making his routine patrol of the outer buildings where the plantation's most valuable equipment was stored. His massive frame moved with surprising quiet for such a large man, years of intimidating slaves having taught him the value of appearing unexpectedly to catch infractions. Phyllis had positioned herself in the feed storage building, knowing that Patterson's route would bring him through to check the grain supplies. The building's interior was dim, filled with the dusty smell of corn and oats, with enough shadows to conceal her presence. She crouched behind a stack of feed sacks, the second rope coiled in her hands, her breathing steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The door creaked open, and Patterson's bulk filled the entrance. "Anyone in here?" he called out, his voice carrying the automatic authority of someone accustomed to being feared. When no one answered, he stepped inside, his heavy boots echoing on the wooden floor. Phyllis waited until he moved deeper into the building, then emerged from her hiding place with the silence of a hunting cat. Patterson was examining some sacks near the far wall when she struck, the rope going around his thick neck before he could react. His massive hands clawed at the hemp as she pulled tight, using her entire body weight to maintain pressure. The big man's strength was formidable, and for a terrifying moment, Phyllis thought he might break free. He bucked and thrashed, his boots scraping against the floor. as he fought for air, but she had positioned herself well, bracing against a support beam to maintain leverage, and gradually his struggles weakened. When Patterson finally went limp, Phyllis didn't release her grip immediately. She had seen too many slaves beaten unconscious only to revive and face even worse punishment. Only when she was certain he was dead did she let the rope slacken. The physical work that followed was more challenging than with McKenna. Patterson's size made him difficult to maneuver, but Phyllis had spent years performing hard physical labor, and desperation gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. Using the hatchet she had retrieved earlier, she completed the grisly work with methodical efficiency. The second rope joined the first in its macabre purpose, creating another message that would be impossible to ignore. As she worked, Phyllis felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching someone else perform these acts. The fear and anger that had driven her to this point had crystallized into something colder and more focused. 2 down, 1 to go. Samuel "Snake" Rodriguez proved to be the most challenging target, not because of physical strength, but because of his cunning. Unlike McKenna and Patterson, who followed predictable patterns, Rodriguez was known for his unpredictability, a trait that had made him particularly effective at psychological torment. Phyllis spent precious minutes tracking him through the plantation grounds, staying to the shadows and moving carefully to avoid detection by the scattered guests and servants. She finally spotted him near the quarters, where he was interrogating a young slave woman about some perceived slight. The woman stood with her head down, trembling as Rodriguez circled her like a predator toying with prey. "You think I don't see what you're doing," Rodriguez was saying, his voice soft but menacing. "You think you can get away with that kind of disrespect on Independence Day? Maybe you need a reminder about what freedom means around here." Phyllis felt the familiar rage building in her chest as she watched the scene. This was exactly the kind of casual cruelty that had defined their daily existence for years. The woman being tormented was barely 18, newer to the plantation and still learning the complex rules of survival under Rodriguez's regime. But rage was a luxury Phyllis could not afford now. She forced herself to remain calm, to think tactically. Rodriguez was in an open area with potential witnesses nearby. She would need to draw him somewhere more isolated. Moving carefully around the perimeter of the quarters, she positioned herself near the smokehouse and began making small noises. The sound of someone trying to move stealthily but not quite succeeding. It was a calculated risk, but one based on her knowledge of Rodriguez's personality. He prided himself on catching slaves in forbidden activities, and the suggestion that someone was skulking around would be irresistible to him. The bait worked perfectly. Within minutes, Rodriguez appeared around the corner of the smokehouse, his hand resting on the coiled whip at his belt. "I know someone's back here," he called out softly. "Might as well come out now and make this easier on yourself." Phyllis stepped out from behind the building, the third rope hidden behind her back. "It's just me, Master Rodriguez," she said, affecting the submissive tone she had perfected over years of survival. "I was just checking on the meat smoking for tomorrow's meals." Rodriguez's eyes narrowed as he studied her face. Something about her demeanor triggered his predatory instincts. She was too calm, too composed for someone caught in a potentially compromising position. "You don't look right," he said slowly. "Something's different about you today." "I don't know what you mean, sir," Phyllis replied, taking a small step closer. "I'm just doing my work like always." But Rodriguez was backing away now, his hand moving toward his whip. Years of psychological manipulation had given him an instinct for danger, and every alarm in his head was sounding. "Where are McKenna and Patterson?" he asked suddenly. "I ain't seen either of them for the past hour." Phyllis smiled then, and Rodriguez saw his death in that expression. He was reaching for his whip when she moved, the rope snaking out like a striking serpent. But he was quicker than his dead colleagues, and the initial loop missed his neck, catching him across the chest instead. The fight that followed was desperate and violent, both participants understanding that only one would walk away. Rodriguez managed to get his whip free and landed several painful strikes before Phyllis could close the distance. But rage and determination proved stronger than skill and experience, and eventually the rope found its target around his throat. As the sun began to set on Independence Day 1827, painting the Louisiana sky in shades of red and gold, the celebration at Magnolia Grove Plantation continued in blissful ignorance of the revolution that had just taken place in its shadows. The wealthy guests remained focused on their food, drink, and conversation about liberty and freedom, while three of their hosts' overseers lay dead in various locations around the property, their bodies arranged in a manner that would become legend throughout the South. Phyllis stood in the gathering dusk behind the smokehouse, looking down at Rodriguez's lifeless form. The third rope had completed its grisly purpose, and her message was now complete. She felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory, only a hollow emptiness where her rage had been, and the certain knowledge that her life as she had known it was over. The practical part of her mind, the part that had kept her alive through years of brutality, began calculating her options. She could run, try to reach the swamps where escaped slaves sometimes managed to survive, for months or even years before being recaptured. She could return to the quarters and pretend innocence when the bodies were discovered, though she knew that pretense would not last long under interrogation. Or she could wait here and face whatever came next with the same resolve that had carried her through the day's bloody work. Before she could decide, she heard voices calling from different parts of the plantation. The overseer's prolonged absence had finally been noticed, and servants were beginning to search for them. It wouldn't be long now before her handiwork was discovered, and then all hell would break loose. Phyllis made her way back toward the quarters, moving through familiar shadows one last time. She wanted to see Moses before the inevitable confrontation, to say goodbye in whatever way she could manage. The quarters were unusually quiet, as most of the slaves were still working to serve the ongoing celebration, but a few elderly and sick individuals remained in their cramped spaces. Moses was awake when she entered their shared room, his fever-bright eyes tracking her movement as she knelt beside him. "I heard some shouting," he whispered. "What's happening out there?" "Change," Phyllis replied simply. She took his burning hand in hers, feeling the fragility of his bones beneath the skin. "Whatever happens next, Moses, you remember that we ain't property. We ain't things to be owned and broken. We're people. And people got rights that can't be taken away, no matter what the law says." Her brother's eyes widened as he absorbed the implications of her words and the finality in her voice. "Sister, what did you do?" Before she could answer, shouts erupted from the direction of the barn. McKenna's body had been found, and the searchers' voices carried a note of horrified disbelief that suggested they had seen the full extent of her message. More voices joined the commotion as Patterson and Rodriguez were discovered in quick succession, and the tone shifted from confusion to rage. "Find every slave on this plantation." Master Whitmore's voice cut through the night like a blade. The celebration had ended abruptly, and she could hear guests hurrying to their carriages, eager to distance themselves from the violence that had erupted in their midst. "Search every building, every hiding place. Someone's going to pay for this." Phyllis squeezed Moses's hand one final time, then rose to her feet. Through the thin walls of the quarters, she could hear the approaching sounds of the search. Boots on dirt, voices raised in anger, the baying of hounds that had been brought in to track scents. She had perhaps minutes before they reached the quarters. She walked outside and stood in the open area between the buildings, her hands at her sides, her head held high. The irony was not lost on her that she was finally experiencing something like the independence that the white folks had been celebrating all day. The freedom that came from having nothing left to lose. The search party found her there, waiting for them in the moonlight. Master Whitmore himself led the group, his face flushed with alcohol and rage, flanked by several of his guests who had stayed to witness the confrontation. Behind them came a mob of plantation workers, overseers from neighboring properties, and local authorities who had been summoned when the extent of the carnage became clear. "You!" Whitmore snarled, pointing a shaking finger at Phyllis. "You did this! I can see it in your eyes." Phyllis looked directly at him, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Yes, sir, I did." The admission sent a ripple of shock through the assembled crowd. Slaves were expected to deny guilt regardless of evidence, to maintain the pretense of innocence, even in the face of certain punishment. Her calm acknowledgement of responsibility was as stunning as the murders themselves. "Why?" Whitmore demanded, his voice cracking with emotion. "Those men were just doing their jobs. They were maintaining order on my property. They were torturing human beings," Phyllis replied, her voice carrying clearly through the humid night air. "They were breaking bodies and spirits for sport, and they were doing it in the name of men who celebrate freedom while keeping other people in chains." What followed was swift and inevitable. There could be no trial, no legal proceedings that might draw unwanted attention to the plantation's brutal practices. Justice would be immediate and public, designed to reinforce the existing order and discourage similar acts of rebellion. As the rope they prepared for her neck was tied with professional efficiency, Phyllis thought about the three men whose deaths had preceded her own. She felt no remorse for what she had done to them. They had earned their fate through years of cruelty and abuse. But she did feel sorrow for the slaves who would face increased oppression in the aftermath of her actions, and for Moses, who would now face his struggles alone. The last thing she saw before the rope tightened was the face of her brother, who had somehow managed to drag himself from his sickbed to witness her final moments. In his eyes, she saw not condemnation, but understanding, and something else that gave her comfort in her final seconds: pride. Phyllis Washington died as the clock struck midnight, marking the end of Independence Day 1827. Her body was left hanging for 3 days as a warning to other slaves, but her story spread. Through whispered conversations from plantation to plantation, carried by field hands and house servants who understood that sometimes the price of human dignity was higher than the cost of human life. In death, she had achieved something that few enslaved people ever managed, a form of immortality that lived on in the collective memory of the oppressed, a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit could not be completely broken. Her name became synonymous with resistance, spoken in hushed tones whenever slaves gathered to share stories of those who had fought back against impossible odds. The 3 overseers were quietly buried and never officially replaced. Master Whitmore sold the plantation within a year, unable to manage the property without his brutal enforcers and unwilling to face the constant reminder of what had happened on his watch. The new owners instituted marginally less harsh conditions, perhaps understanding that excessive cruelty could breed the kind of desperation that led to revolutionary acts. But the story lived on, passed down through generations of enslaved families, a testament to the truth that freedom could not be given. It had to be taken, regardless of the cost.